This is Unit 3.4, Carrying Capacity, and Unit 3.5, Population Growth and Resources Availability. To get into both carrying capacity and resources availability, we need to talk about characteristics of populations. So we measure the size of populations, right? How many individuals they have, how they're distributed geographically, how dense they are, how they are dispersed over areas, how quickly they grow or shrink, and then also the age structure within those populations. So we'll do each of these, touch each of these characteristics. So population size is literally the number of individuals in a population. When we're talking about organisms in the wild, it's important to know the number of individuals, but it's difficult to measure. So why do you think that is? I mean, for any number of animals, it can be animals moving into and out of places that you're trying to measure, right? If you have a field, how do you measure the number of mice in that field when the mice are always moving around? The same thing for the ocean, especially the ocean, where you have schools of fish. Like, how do you measure those fish, the number of fish? So it's good to know the population size, but it's always a challenge to measure it. So the geographic distribution is the area that's inhabited by a population. So this can be small or large, right? Let's say you're talking about a population of mold. It might just be the slice of bread that the mold is on. Or you have whales that migrate over hundreds of kilometers in the ocean. So literally the area that's inhabited by its population is its distribution. Within that area, population may be more or less dense. So the number of individuals, right, per unit area. So you take your population size, which was number one, and you divide it by your geographic distribution area, right, which was number two, and you get your population density. But even so, you can have different density in different areas. Questions that you need to answer are, what is a species that has a low population density, right? What are species that stay far away from each other? And what is a population, or what is a species that has a high population density? You should have examples of both of these for yourself. It doesn't have to be the same one as anybody else, but for low population density, think of organisms that don't like to be near each other. High population density, either organisms that do or are close to each other because they have to be. So we also look at dispersion. So within the population, how are those individuals distributed? So different types of dispersion. We'll look at clumped, right, where organisms are always close together. We'll look at random, where there is no pattern. And then this is both different from uniform or even distribution. For example, clump dispersion, right? All these individuals are close together, and you can see that in the photo with the starfish all being clumped around each other. Clump dispersion results from social behavior, right? Schools of fish, flocks of geese, herds of sheep, all have social interactions, and that keeps them together. Resources that can be clumped, right? If you have a oasis in the desert where there's water, right? Animals will tend to clump around that water. Also food, right? If food is clumped, then organisms will clump around that food. Uniform dispersion is where individuals are separated by roughly even distances. And this can be the result of social interactions, right? If you see these penguins in the photo, they're close to each other, but not too close because they have some social interactions. Right, the individuals trying to get away from each other, but if you have lots of individuals, then they have to maintain some sort of distance from each other. They can't just be as far away as possible all the time. Finally, there's random dispersion, where the location of each individual is independent of the location of any other individual. So you might get clumps, or you might get individuals that are far away. Tend to see this with plants. where seed dispersal is caused by wind or animals and is essentially random. Because of dispersion, you'll sometimes see metapopulations where they're smaller populations that are distinct spatially from other populations. There can be movements of individuals among the populations from one to the other. And this can happen, one way this can happen is through wildlife corridors, where we talked about how sometimes habitats can become fragmented and the populations within those fragments might not interact if not for the wildlife corridors. So there's some photos, you can see these, like often these will be bridges over highways, right, where the animals can literally walk across the bridges. Sometimes you need to go under, so you can have tunnels under highways, or in the case of these crabs, you have sort of a tunnel under a sidewalk, basically. You can even make, bee highways, right? Bees need places to go, so you create, pollination stations and places where the bees can go from place to place on their highway. Another measure of populations is their growth rate. And so we'll call this an intrinsic rate of increase, like how fast the population grows on its own. If a population were to have unlimited resources, you would see a curve like this, where it goes up and it goes up very fast with no bound. So this occurs when there are ideal factors, right? Lots of food, plenty of space, no predators or disease, right? Where all of those things, a lack of food or space, presence of predators or disease would prevent it from increasing too fast. And we call this a J curve because it looks like the letter J. We see four characteristics of populations that grow rapidly. Timing of reproduction, right? If they reproduce early in life, then we see populations grow much faster. Another characteristic is the time between generations. So if you have, generation reproduce early in life and they grow up quickly to again be able to reproduce, then the time between generations is short. So short generation time is a rapidly growing population. The length of reproductive lives. So populations that grow fast have individuals that have long amounts of time that they can reproduce. So you have some animals that can reproduce many times, and so their length of reproduction is quite long. Finally is the number of offspring. There's a word for this called fecundity. So animals that have lots of offspring, or I should say organisms that have lots of offspring, their populations grow more rapidly. So many offspring results in a high fecundity. So how do populations? Why don't populations grow like that indefinitely? So limiting factors, right? Anything that limits population growth. Here we see a predator limiting the population growth of a rodent of some kind. So what are some of these limiting factors? Like we talked in general about some of them, but how specific, right? Light is a limiting factor, right? Because plants can't produce food if they don't have enough light. Water is a limiting factor, space, competition. So species that are competing for the same resources, of course, there aren't enough resources to support both populations, so then it will not grow indefinitely. Predation, predators help control populations, as does disease. So we're going to group limiting factors into two categories. One is going to be density-dependent limiting factors. So these are limiting factors that depend on the size of the population, how dense they are. So competition and predation, right? Populations that are more dense are good for predators preying on them, but it also causes more competition, right? So if you have a population that's more dense, individuals within that population can also be competing for resources. Disease tends to happen more in populations that are dense, and food is more scarce when you have a dense population. Also, for animals that nest, we'll see a shortage of nesting sites. And you should know why or how these things depend on density. Consider these very densely populated penguins. limiting factors that are independent of density, right? These don't depend on the population size or its distribution. So weather or natural disasters affect populations independent of how dense they are. Some human activities will affect populations like independent of density. Building dams or clear cutting forests, right, are independent of the density of those populations. So what happens when you have a population that reaches its roughly maximum value due to limiting factors? That maximum value is called the carrying capacity. And we use the letter capital K to denote the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the amount of a population that can be supported by an environment over long periods of time. And how this works is that populations will overshoot the carrying capacity, right? So if you look at this graph on the lower corner of the screen, you see a population of, let's say, humans, right, in the millions, and it might overshoot the carrying capacity. So from like 1850, the population went up to like 1.8. But then because there weren't enough resources, then the population would drop back down. But then once it's below the carrying capacity, it can support more people. So the population number just goes up and down around the carrying capacity depending on how many individuals there are and how many resources there are. We'll call this logistic growth, right, where population growth slows after a period of exponential growth. And this is what we'll call an S-curve, where in the early time, growth is rapid, and then it slows down until later growth is approaching zero. So this is logistic growth. A lot of assumptions in carrying capacity is that carrying capacity is constant. So when you looked at that graph, you could see a little asymptote, a little dashed line where the carrying capacity maxes out. But carrying capacity is not always constant. And really, you should think about what factors would change that would affect carrying capacity. Consider that you had a forest with trees that's home to birds and squirrels and all kinds of things. What would affect the carrying capacity of that forest in terms of the population of birds and squirrels that can be supported? And most of the time, what is the source of that change? Right, well, that is Unit 3.4 and Unit 3.5. Please let me know if you have any questions.